Hi guys, how are you? I hope all of you were having an amazing day. Welcome back to EP Science Virtual Class. And once again, this is Jendrox Educator TV, your host for today. For today's video, you are going to learn about the significance of food web. Last time, we discussed about the important roles in the ecosystem with these producers, consumers. Under that consumers, we have primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, quaternary consumers or final consumers, and also the decomposers. So this time, we are going to focus about food web. How can we differentiate about food chain and food web? Are they the same? What is meant by a food chain? A food chain, it is a flow of energy in an ecosystem, is one-way process, right? So in one series, the sequence of organisms through which the energy flows is known as food chain. Let us remember that there are many organisms involved in a consumers, right? So usually in a primary consumers, these organisms are herbivores. In a secondary consumers, these organisms are carnivores. In a tertiary consumers, these organisms are considered as omnivores. So when we talk about omnivores, we are both animals and plant eaters. Just remember guys that there are different types of food chain. So these are grazing food chain and detritus food chain. In a grazing food chain, those consumers utilizing plants. So means to say, those animals, the first animal should be a plant eater, right? So will serve as their food. At the same time, this food chain begins from green plants and the primary consumers are herbivores. Say for example, in a grazing food chain, there are many organisms within the ecosystem, right? So let us remember that we have producer, the primary consumer, the secondary consumer, the tertiary consumer, and the final consumer, right? Our main producer is a flower. That flower is eaten by caterpillar. That caterpillar is eaten by a frog. And that frog is eaten by the snake. And that snake is eaten by an owl. What about the detritus food chain? So what does that mean? These type of organisms are food chain that starts from dead organic matter. When you talk about detritus food chain, they are considered as microorganisms. Okay? So detritus feeding organisms to other predators. For example, of a detritus food chain, okay? So there is a dead organic matter. So that dead organic matter was being eaten by a bacteria, millipedes, aerobic respirations, and it serves as an organic nutrients. This time we will focus about food webs. Alright? So what is food web? When we talk about food web, can be defined as a network of food chains which are interconnected at various trophic levels, so as to form a number of feeding connections among different organisms in a biotic community. Alright, so within the forest, in the grassland, or in the marine ecosystem. Okay, so they are known as consumer resource system. There are different food webs, okay, in the ecosystem. So what are they? Like soil food web. So those organisms within the soil, like an earthworm. So where do they get food? Aquatic food web. Alright? So in the water or at the sea. What about food web in the forest? Okay, so those organisms live in the forest or in the mountains. What about food web in the grassland? Those animals that eat grasses or plants. Then lastly, we have food web in terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem. The examples of the soil food web. So how are they arranged? In this way, there is what we call a plant shoots or the roots. Nematodes, mycorrhizae or fungi, other organic matter, bacteria, protozoa, earthworms, arthropods, then other animals, and also birds. So they are part of the soil food web. Let's move to aquatic food web. So there are organisms involved in this one. So how do they interact in one ecosystem? How they grow? So they obtain food, okay? Those fishes and other marine organisms, like for example, shrimps, prawns, crabs, fishes, right? Whale shark, and all other large animals that lived at the sea. Next one, we will talk about food web in the forest. So what are those organisms involved? Especially those animals lived in the forest or in the mountains, right? Of course, there are the presence of green plants and that serves as producers, the mouse, owl, snake, rabbit, goat, jackals, lion, wildcat. Next type is all about grassland food web. So what are those organisms involved within that grassland ecosystem? Who are those plant eaters? Of course, these organisms are mouse, grasshopper, lizard, rabbit, snake, and eagle. So in a food web, in a grassland ecosystem, there are 5 possible food chains involved. Lastly, we have food web in terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem. So both organisms that lived in land and water, alright? Of course, these are involved with producers, primary consumers, which is herbivores. We have secondary consumers, which is carnivores, the tertiary consumers, which is omnivores or both plant and animal eaters. And lastly, the largest one, which is quaternary consumers that consumes the final energy. What are the significance of food web? Why is that important? Remember, food webs distinguish the level of producers and consumers by identifying and defining the importance of animals' relationship, and for food sources beginning with primary producers such as plants, insects, and herbivores. Food web are important tools in the understanding that plants are the foundation of all ecosystem and food chains, sustaining life by providing nourishment and oxygen needed for survival and reproduction. So food web provides stability to the ecosystem, so it creates balance of the ecosystem. This time we will talk about the ecological pyramid. Let us try to analyze this table about ecological pyramids. At the bottom part, there is what we call producer, okay, mainly the plants. Second step, we have primary consumers, which we considered as herbivores. Next stage, we have secondary consumers, which we considered as primary carnivores. Last step, or at the top, we have tertiary consumers that we considered as secondary carnivores. So how do they interact? These organisms played within the ecological pyramids. Ecological pyramids are graphical representation of the trophic structure in the ecosystem. So how does those organisms, right, survive, grow, and lived in a particular period of time? In a trophic levels are the feeding positions in a food chain such as primary producers, herbivores, and primary carnivores. So at that particular point, alright, there are organisms that was being eaten by large organisms. Now, look at these pyramid numbers. The food relationship between organisms in the food chain can be represented in the form of pyramid, right? A pyramid of numbers is a diagram that shows the relative number of organisms at each level of food chain. Now let us start from the first level, okay, at the bottom portion, which is the producer. There are 3 million blades of grass. Then on the second level, that is what we call primary consumer, there are 3,000 grasshoppers that used to eat those producers or blade of grasses. However, that primary consumer will be eaten by the secondary consumer. In a third level, there are 150 frogs that used to eat 3,000 grasshoppers in a primary consumers. Lastly, there are 5 snakes. That could be the last or the top level in which that tertiary consumer or snakes will be at the top, right? According to the pyramid of numbers. So as you can see in the figure above, there is a progressive drop in the number of organisms from lower level to higher level. So the animals at the higher levels tend to be larger in size. What do you think will happen if that tertiary consumer, which is 5 snakes, can't find food anymore? Snakes died and it ends up to the soil and undergoes decomposition matter by the help of our decomposers, which is bacteria and fungi. Alright? How does energy flow in a food web and a pyramid numbers? Let us remember, in a food chain or a food web also shows how the energy is transferred from one organism to another. In an ecosystem, the main source of energy is sunlight, in order that those producers like plants can grow and obtain their own energy to manufacture their own food. Green plants trap and changes solar energy into chemical energy, which is stored in food during photosynthesis. When a primary consumer eats the producers, some of the chemicals energy is stored in the plants and it is passed on the primary consumer, which would later pass its energy to secondary consumer. In this way, energy flows through a food web and the pyramid of numbers. However, not all of the energy is passed on at each level. Some energy is lost as heat. Food webs are not permanent in any community or ecosystem. Some animals and plants may die. Some animals may leave the community while some ones may move into another habitat or another community. This time, guys, I want you to understand and analyze, or you can write your own explanation about the energy flow in a food web and pyramid numbers. So please look at and understand carefully about this illustration. Let's do a practice test. Guys, this is the end of our topic for today regarding about food web and food chain. Please don't forget to answer your quizzes and assignment at the Google Classroom in the AP website. Thank you so much for listening and watching this video. Stay home, stay safe, enjoy learning at home. Good luck!